Okay, I start to introduce our moderator, Michael Hornsby from Transparency International. This is actually the second panel he's moderating at the Disruption Network Club. The title of this panel is Exposing Abuses, Citizens Recording Human Rights Violation from the US to the Gambia. Michael Hornsby is a communication officer at Transparency International. He's working on projects to enhance collaboration with investigative journalists and seek stronger protection for European whistleblowers. He studied at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and the Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. And I really want to thank you for moderating this and also the cooperation that led to this panel. And also just want to say two words about some panel participants, because I think it's also nice to say that I met the first time Melissa Segura at the Logan Symposium in Berkeley, and her talk that she is also going to refer today was a really huge inspiration for this conference. So I really want to tell you this because it was a topic that inspired actually the title Citizen of Evidence. And also I want to say that for some it's the first time in Germany, so this is also great. It's the first talk here in Germany, so enjoy that, and I leave the stage to you.
Thank you, Tatiana. So changing tack maybe a little bit from the previous presentation, maybe less poetic, but still talking about storytelling from the margins, perhaps. We'll be hearing from three panelists who not only bring to light hugely important issues of injustice and cases of abuse of human rights, but also who shine a light on different aspects, different facets of the theme of this conference, that is the role of citizens in exposing abuse by governments. On the far left, we have Melissa Segura, an investigative reporter from BuzzFeed News. In the middle, Sam Sinyangwe, data scientist and policy analyst at Campaign Zero and the Police Scorecard. And to my left, Gareth Benest, facilitator of participatory video projects. We'll start with Melissa. Melissa is a reporter at BuzzFeed News and also an Emerson Fellow at the think tank New America. Her reporting focuses on the intersection of justice, class, and race. In 2017, she authored a landmark investigation detailing how a group of predominantly working-class Latina women from Chicago had uncovered evidence suggesting a police detective had framed at least 51 of their sons, brothers, or husbands. This series has led to the exoneration of 10 men who had spent each decades behind bars. The series has earned her the George Polk Award in Journalism and recognition as a finalist for Harvard's Goldsmith Award. She's now working on a book that examines the cracks in the criminal justice system in the US and the hidden role that women play in correcting injustices. Please, round of applause for Melissa.
Thank you so much for welcoming me here. It's definitely an honor to be here in Germany for the first time as well. So Sam and I are both Berlin neophytes. But as a storyteller, I hope you don't mind if I just tell you a couple stories that I myself have learned in the process of reporting this story that followed, as Michael said, a group of working-class Latino women who for decades had fought on behalf of their sons. And you'll see, I think, through the course of this, why the story meant so much to me. And I think, for me personally, it begins on November 10th, 2011. For me, that's the day that the entire trajectory of my life changed forever. And I remember two things most specifically about that day. I remember how hard the bench outside the courtroom where I was sitting felt beneath me. And I also remember how much I wanted to throw up at that particular moment. And I had been a reporter for more than a decade by that time. This was not new to me in any way, sitting outside a courthouse waiting for proceedings to begin. But what was definitely different about that day is it was the first time I was waiting for the court personnel to come out and to call the name of somebody who I loved. And when that court personnel came out, they were calling out for Alfredo Sandoval. But to me, he'd always been just Freddie.
I remember when my nephew first came into my life, and he was, my memories of him are him sort of bounding around, sort of these brown matted waves, you know, sort of held down by his hair gel. And I remember him as a kid running around with this Michael Jordan jersey that he refused to take off for like 3, I am not taking this thing off even to sleep days. I don't know if any parents have had that experience where your kid won't take something off. And I also remember most clearly as well that when my brother was telling me about my nephew, I was living away at the time, he said, you know, Freddie comes with a little bit of a warning. And he said he doesn't necessarily have tantrums like most kids do. He has meltdowns. And what I didn't totally understand at that time was my brother was very tactfully trying to distinguish for me the difference sort of between a paper cut and a stab wound. I mean, both are painful, both can cut, but really only the latter will kill you. And I didn't totally understand that at the time, nor did I understand that when I would come home on vacations from college or from work, that Freddie and we'd play hide and seek, and I didn't know that, you know, us counting to 10, because he only spoke Spanish at the time. I didn't know at that particular time also that these games, like these quiet games, which he has never ever won against me in this, you know, even to this day. And I didn't know that sort of this mutual love that we have of baseball would sort of form this bond between us that would last, you know, well beyond time, distance, and I'd argue even reason at various points in my life. And then one day, as you know, years pass, my nephew's meltdowns didn't really improve in any way. They were actually just more difficult because he was older, and the consequences, of course, were more profound. And these meltdowns started fraying the edges of my brother's marriage. And one Thanksgiving, I'm at home, and I go to the restroom, and in that time, my soon-to-be ex-sister-in-law puts my nephew in the back of a car and drives away and moves that family to Texas. This was a nephew with whom I'd had a profound and deep connection, and I never even had the chance to say goodbye to him. I had tried, of course, as soon as he was old enough to get a cell phone and to communicate with him. But every text message that I sent was basically met with absolutely nothing. But yet I still tried. And finally, one day, in April of 2011, he did respond. And, you know, through the years, I had sort of stopped. I was a Major League Baseball reporter long before this. I know it's sort of a transition to investigative journalism. But I would stop by and I would buy all these commemorative bats and pins and all sorts of Major League regalia that I always bought for him, and I would just save them. And I texted him, I think, offering up some of this to him at that particular time. And this day he actually did respond. And he told me, just sort of in this long, rambling text message, how, you know, he was 17 at that time, he dropped out of school, he'd gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and he was, quote, and I remember this phrasing very clearly, slanging rock. And I was so completely naive that I thought that maybe he'd taken a job as a mason somewhere. When I went to urbandictionary.com, thank God for that site, I found out that, of course, that's not what it meant at all. And I was going through and I was texting him. I was like, Freddie, you can't sell drugs. I was ticking off every sort of bad crime American show that I'd ever seen. And I said, you're going to end up arrested. And he says, well, you're going to end up in jail. And he says, well, I've already been there. And I sort of pecked back on my keyboard. And I'm like, well, as a reporter, I knew if he'd been arrested, there probably were some subsequent hearing. And he said, no, nothing happens. And as a reporter, I know that in the American criminal justice system, nothing never happens. So I again ply my trade as a sports reporter, but I still apply, you know, those same sort of questioning skills. And I go to the courthouse in San Antonio, Texas, where he lived. I pull up the files and find out that my nephew, in what, you know, probably 20 years ago would have been a house party fight, was now facing 20 years for a trumped-up charge of robbery. But in the course of this, I also did some more investigation. I used those same reporting skills and found out that there was absolutely no way he committed this crime, this quote-unquote crime, I should say. And so that's how I found myself, back on November 10th, 2011, sitting outside that courtroom, ready to vomit, because I knew that my nephew was innocent. But I also knew at the very same time I was sort of dealing with my own crisis. And that's that the very same reporting skills that I was depending on to exonerate my nephew were also the very same skills that I was going to be fired for in a matter of months as a journalist. Of course, we all know that it's not exactly the most stable industry. And every single day, I was hearing at work that the very same skills that I was going to be depending on to save my nephew's life were the same skills I was being told over and over and over again weren't good enough for a sports magazine. So I was sort of dealing with my own personal issues of sort of like my own imprisonment, whether it be like of shame and self-doubt and those kind of issues. And so that's sort of what brings me to this point. And I'm sure like now you all are wondering like, if you walked into the wrong room, if this is like an Oprah Super Soul Sunday conversation or some sort of self-help talk or something like that, but it's not. Because what I can tell you is that through this, my experience with Freddie, it sort of brought me to a profound place of brokenness. And that brokenness is exactly what has taught me how to be a reporter able to do high impact work. What I learned through this whole entire experience is that it's not enough, I think, to be able to simply expose pain, as we do as journalists, if you don't connect to it. And the only way that I know how to connect to sort of erase that line between us and them, between the readers who are privileged and the subjects who might not be so, is I think through that brokenness, through that shared humanity. And the only way that I know how to get to that shared humanity is through that particular brokenness. And I applied that when in 2015, I was out of work at Sports Illustrated, where I had been, spent most of my career. Didn't know exactly what I was gonna do, so like any good American, I thought I'd go to law school. So after that, but I needed a job. I needed health insurance. I needed, a steady paycheck because I was still paying off the loan that I had taken to find legal representation for my nephew. So I needed something, and I happened to be scrolling through Twitter, and it actually was not a whole repository of awfulness that it generally is, because I actually found a job posting, and it was a one-year offer to work at BuzzFeed News. It was an investigative fellowship, and I said, okay, well, I remember during my sports reporting, I had come across a story of a man, of a lawyer out of San Diego, California, who for the past 20 years had been traveling on his own time and on his own dime to Chicago, Illinois, where he had been representing the same woman. And I thought, what in the world would drive somebody to do something for 20 years? And that was the question, and it's because he was so profoundly convinced of her innocence that he had to make sure that she was free. And so when I saw this job opening, I thought, okay, well, I can write about that, without any single idea that as soon, and I wish that this were some great feat of investigative journalism, but it wasn't, I popped this particular detective in this woman's case into Google, and I saw these old message boards from like union websites and from sort of like these marginalized, like the plumbers union, I think, had something saying, hey, my nephew was caught up in something, or my son was framed by the same detective. And so I started to pause, right? You hear it once, okay, you hear it twice, but suddenly, as I was going through the Google results, I was seeing maybe 3 times. So I end up on a plane. I end up, I think, packing for 4 days to go to Chicago, and instead end up moving there for 6 months. And I'm reporting this story, and again, I'm not very confident in my own abilities given like sort of the terrible breakup to which I'm not allowed to say because of a non-disclosure agreement with my previous job. I was shaky. I wasn't exactly sure what I was supposed to do. And I will tell you that was probably one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. Because instead of being so confident, instead of being so sure that I knew every single question that I was supposed to ask, and that I was not only sure what question I was going to ask, but I was sure what answer I would get, right? Because I was so prepared that I went in and I'm like, look, I'm going to listen. I'm not showing up here to talk to you. I'm showing up here at these doorsteps of these humble and sort of disenfranchised folks to listen. And I think that that was one of the keys for me in being able to bring about and to discover this story, is not to find 3 cases, but I ended up sitting, I think, in one of my very first interviews, and I had no idea that there was a whole cadre of women who had gotten together when I was still in elementary school and had already started investigating and discovering. And this case was so, I mean, their work was so old that they were producing spreadsheets way before Excel. They were doing it on Lotus, which I didn't even know about until I had to start doing this story. I didn't even know that there was a program like that. I mean, they had everything. And it's just because somebody happened to tell me. It's not because I knew that this story was about this. When I walked in, I thought the story perhaps was about this detective, when in reality, just by shutting up as a reporter, I ended up learning that the story was very much about these women and about their amazing, courageous, and brave fight for their loved ones for the past 20 years. And so in the course of that takes me, I'm not a big slide person, but this is like sort of what we used. It ends up being about sort of a lot of these women you see up here are women who have, I mean, so much so that it's generational at this point, as you see some younger faces in there. But the women in the top 2, sort of left-hand corner, are 2 aunts who I end up profiling in the main piece, who took their nephew, and of course this was a familiar pain to me. The second one in ends up moving into her father's unfinished basement in Chicago, where it's very cold. She leaves her apartment so that she's able to give all of her money to her nephew's legal fees after he's accused of a double homicide. She knows that he's innocent because the woman to her left, her sister Mary, is at home with their nephew the night that this particular crime happens. So, and then you see sort of you'll see like a younger woman there. She's the second one in from the left. Her mother is one of the ones who founded this particular group. Like, that's how long this story had been out there. And I think for me, one of the things that I learned is that by just sitting down and listening to what was happening in this community, I discovered a story that had been there for the taking for more than 20 years. And so I think that that's really one of the powers of just sometimes just very basically, I know that this is sometimes it's almost too obvious, but I think really does bear repeating, that sometimes your only job is to show up and listen. The second thing that I sort of learned from being like a train wreck when I was reporting this, and it starts to feel, I think, a little bit more like the ghosts on A Christmas Carol, right? Where like these folks like show up and start like teaching you these various things. I think in many ways that's what this gentleman, Antonio McDowell, was to me. In many ways, I learned from him that it's very possible that despite my education and my opportunity and all my advantages, that this man behind me, who was arrested at age 19 and is serving a 110-year sentence for a murder that he most likely did not commit, had way more information and had way more ability to tell me how to do my job than I would have even thought. So it starts with Antonio, where one day I walk in and he's been charged with this murder in which he's accused of walking into a garage, a couple of days before Christmas and murdering a young father, then rifling through his pockets. This happens in a neighborhood that's clearly across town from where he lives. The only thing that we know about the killer is that he was wearing a Nike hat, according to witness statements, and a green t-shirt. That's the only information that we know about this particular case. It is assigned to the detective who is at the heart of this story, who's been accused of framing more than 50 people for murders they don't commit, and we count Antonio as one of them. I was very proud by this point. I had gone through a couple of cases, I had done a lot of reporting, and I thought I knew everything about his case cold. I'm feeling a little bit more confident by this point, and he's telling me, he says, I ask him what I thought was actually the most basic question when I walk in, like with my files nice and organized, everything ready to go, and I say, Antonio, can you please tell me why you're innocent? And he looks at me and goes, innocent? And I swear, he rolled his eyes like I was the dumbest person who ever walked the face of the earth, right? And he tells me, no, that's not how you do this. That's not how you do this at all. The only way you're going to know I'm innocent is if you do everything in your power to prove that I'm guilty, because you can't. And that is like a mindset and a methodology that I applied to every single case I evaluated from there on out. And I will tell you that it saved my ass a few times, because there were a few people who were, pretending they're innocent, and it wasn't true. And by using this particular, approach that he had taught me, he ended up saving me from looking like a fool in several instances. So I think, like, as journalists, sometimes we're so hardwired to be in control of the situation that we don't necessarily listen to our sources and know that they might be able to show us a new path to the truth. So that was probably one of the second biggest lesson that I learned along the way. The next sort of shows up to me in the form of a struggling heroin addict by the name of Francisco Vicente. Mr. Vicente was 19 years old, and again had a record for petty theft, like we see with a lot of folks who are struggling with addiction. But yet, this detective at the heart of this case ends up taking Mr. Vicente, throwing him in a room, and if you believe Mr. Vicente's story, he is beaten until he gives he gives false witness, not in one, not in two, but in 3 separate murder investigations. He ends up lying, giving sworn statements that he says are absolutely not true. Those statements end up sending 5 different men to prison for over 200 years. Now, Mr. Vicente, I have been chasing this guy down for years. Literally, it took me 3 years to be able to find him. I pull up to this pizzeria on the outside of Chicago where I know that he works. I'm waiting for him by this dumpster. It is so glamorous, I can't even tell you, for him to be able to walk out. And the first time I approach him, I introduce myself, "Hi, I'm Melissa." And I remember his words exactly to me, and it was, "Fuck off, bitch, leave me alone." And the problem is, as journalists, we've heard way worse than that, right? So no, of course I didn't do that. Instead, what I did is I fostered relationships with, say, the mother of his child. His cousins, his brothers, all became like guests at my Thanksgiving table, right? Because I needed them to be able to trust me in order to engender the trust that he needed to have in me. And so after 3 years of this, Francisco finally sits down with me. And one of the first things that I learned from him, and I know it's very difficult because so many of us are under such time constraints these days and we don't have the luxury of time, but one of the first, I think, and most important lessons that I've learned is, especially when you're dealing with the poor, they don't have PR teams. They don't have any lobbyists who are working for them and pushing their agenda. So in many cases, it's going to be about time. You're dealing with folks who, when you're working on the margins, these are people who have suffered tremendous harm. In many cases, that harm is followed right behind by some serious trauma. And so their stories don't always come out in a linear fashion. They don't come out nice and neat, and in some cases, they contain contradictions that make us as journalists want to tear our hair out. But I think through the process of just giving them time to be able to speak is one of the most incredibly powerful tools that we have, is just sort of empowering people on the margins to be able to tell their story. And I can't tell you how many times, especially with the inmates, that I was the first person who had actually taken the time to listen to them, to actually hear their explanations, and how incredibly empowering that is for your subject matters. The second thing that I learned in this Vicente interview was the ability to sort of cede some of the control. And what that means is I let him set a lot of the interview terms. When he wanted to take a smoke break, he knew that he could take a smoke break. When he needed to be able to sort of gain his composure when he was talking about some of this trauma, he had time to gain his composure. I think the first meeting that I had with him, we sat at a diner for 8 hours, because that's how long it took us to be able to sort of get to that level of trust, to be able to get to that place where he could go there and actually tell the stories that I needed him to tell. And then the last thing that I learned, which was very important, and I would never do this, with somebody who's powerful, somebody who has some sort of authority or voice, but I think it's very important when I was dealing with any of these story subjects, is to establish some assurances to them. Things don't necessarily always come out as polished as they might like them to be or as true. So it's being able to go back to them and say, hey, this is what we're writing. And I do this because they are the ones who are vulnerable, and they are the ones who are going to have to deal with the consequences of what is published. And in this particular story that I wrote that featured the two aunts that we were looking at earlier, I had no idea what was actually going to be sensitive to them because I don't live their lives. And it was one tiny line about their nephew's mother that ended up being, I think, one of the most difficult parts for them. And I would have never have known that. So being able to go back and say, hey, we're going to, whatever like the terms might be, and again, it's not giving them control, like to be able to control the story, because that's not what's happening. It's being able to offer them assurances that they are going to know what is happening, that they're not going to be surprised by anything, or that they can't explain to you the potential harm that might come from them sharing your story with them. So those are three things that I like to keep in mind, that I specifically learned through Francisco and through his story. And then probably the most important thing is when we're writing about people on the margins, we're writing about people who inherently nobody gives a crap about, right? I mean, that's why they're on the margins. So how in the world was I going to help anybody? How in the world was I going to write the story about a bunch of Latino men, mostly Latino and Black men in Chicago, who had like these, some of them had tattoos and rap sheets that would make you clutch your purse, right? I mean, if you didn't know anything else. And how was I going to make anybody care about people who are virtually invisible? And that's when I really had to do a lot of deep thinking and realize that it's never enough to simply expose harm. You have to connect people to it, right? And the way that I ended up strategically doing this is to realize what separates us from them. And that's that, you know, for a lot of these guys, you know, they weren't like these hardened gang members. They were Roberto, like who had to iron his pants, like with absolute laser-like perfection before he went out anywhere. There was Jose, who was like so funny that like he puts like any comedian to shame. There were all of these people and these characteristics, and there was depth and dimension, and that's who they were to their mothers, right? And so who wouldn't understand a mother being able to do anything and everything, even if it's 20 years, to be able to fight for their loved one, right? That's a journey that I don't care how rich you are, I don't care how poor you are, most likely you can identify with that. So that ended up being the approach that we took for the story. And also because I think, you know, sort of secondarily, it honored their work that they had done. Because for so many years, these women had gone to the authorities, they'd gone to the people who were supposed to protect them. And instead their social status was sort of confused and for like their intellect, for their credibility. And I didn't want that to happen in this piece. And even other journalists had sort of dismissed them and waved them off as like crazy tinfoiled, you know, conspiracy theorists. And so when thinking about how do we tell these stories, how do we make people care, I think it's always really, really important to figure out what is universal, what is human about all of these things. And so that's what we did. And when we published this particular story, it was 10 days afterwards that this happened.
So behind me, the family is waiting for Robert Almodovar to be released from prison. He's been in there for 23 years. We just got word that Robert is actually walking out right now. Robert's actually walking out right now.
That's his daughter, who was 6 months old when he was incarcerated.
What do you guys plan on doing?
Plan to go to my aunt's house and eat some Puerto Rican food.
We gotta get new ones.
Yeah.
That say freedom.
It's great. It's unbelievable.
Telephone.
Hello? Can you hear
Now you have the rest of your life?
Yes. Yes.
So right after that, I'm in sort of like the background over here, and I'm typing up my notes, for the story that we're going to publish about our story subject's release that day. And the crowd starts to thin. Everybody's starting to go home, to go eat pasteles with Roberto's family. Media goes, I'm still there finishing up my notes, sitting on a curb. And when I'm finally done, I remember on that particular day, which I consider to be sort of the second happiest day of my life, watching him walk free, watching sort of the power of our work unfold like that. I sort of shut my computer and I think back to what was the happiest day of my life. And that was 6 years earlier. And that was the day that I got the phone call that the prosecutors in my own nephew's case were dropping the charges based on the work that we were able to show. And so I pick up my phone and I call my nephew and I explain to him all that's happened and sort of how that sort of trauma of what we went through together has helped and served somebody else in some other family. And I call and I pick him up. When I pick up the phone, I hear in the background he's got, the machinery, which, that's very loud. He works now, as we joke, he legally slangs rock as a trained stonemason. So that's sort of a joke that we now have. And I talk to the man who's sort of become an incredible father, a hardworking man. Everything that I was so terrified that felony record, had he been convicted, had he been in prison, would have ruined. And I pick him up, and I'm telling him this on the phone, what I've just seen. And he tells me, he says, you freed me. And you not only saved me, but you freed him. And for me, I'm like tearing up. This giant lump is in my throat because of, everything that's happened, sort of like our own heartbreak, my own sort of brokenness and not feeling like anybody would want to trust me with their story. And I sit and I think, and I'm like, I might have helped free them, but they had helped free me too. And that's sort of what I've learned working on this story. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you, Melissa, for that beautifully told and incredible story of empathy in reporting. I'm sure there's lots of questions from the audience. I have a few myself, but we'll save those until the end of the three presentations because we're limited for time. So we'll move on to Sam. Sam Sinyangwe is a data scientist who leads the development of research, digital tools, and platforms to end police violence and systemic racism in America. He has been named one of the Forbes 30 Under 30 and the Route 100. He has been involved in organizing and advocacy since he was in high school, previously working for PolicyLink and working with city leaders, youth activists, and community organizations to achieve quality education, health, and justice for young Black men. He graduated from Stanford University in 2012, where he studied how race and racism impact the US political system. Sam, take it away.
Okay, so my story begins on August 9th, 2014. That's the day that Mike Brown Jr. was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri by the police. Now, you'll recall that his death became national news. It sparked a nationwide movement that really became a global movement protesting racial injustice and specifically the injustice of police violence in the United States and reverberating across the world. In the year since his death, we saw 4 times as many protests within the United States as were seen during the height of the civil rights movement. A huge, major movement erupted, but in the early days and weeks and months of that movement, there was a sincere question about data. And that's because the federal government, while we were seeing video after video after video of people being killed by the police, the federal government in the United States still to this day does not collect comprehensive data on people killed by police. So the government could tell you how much rainfall there was in rural Missouri going back 100 years. They could not tell you how many people the police had killed last year or the year before. So my background is in data. I'm a data scientist. And I knew that having the numbers, having the data would be a powerful tool to be able to inform people about this issue and then to drive policy change to address it. And so I connected with activists on the ground in Ferguson through Twitter. Like, I didn't know folks. I was actually in Oakland at the time. I was a researcher working on issues of educational inequity. But I connected online, digitally, to folks on the ground in Ferguson. And together we built the most comprehensive database on police violence in the country, called Mapping Police Violence. We really launched with this map. And it might be a little bit hard to see, but you can probably see the red pins. This is a map of the United States, and the red pins are incidents of people killed by police in 2014. We were able, despite the federal government refusing and failing to do so, we were able, through public records requests, through information that we were able to find online on social media, through obituaries, through local media reports, compiling all of this information in collaboration with local organizations to produce a comprehensive database of people killed by police. And what we found was that there were 1,200 people killed by police that year. Not only that, but we had data, we were able to compile data going back to 2013, and now we have it going all the way through 2018. And what we found was that every single year the police were killing 1,200 people. And that's about 3 to 4 people every day. And we wanted to understand this issue a little bit better, to dive deeper into how police violence was impacting particular communities, especially the communities that were taking to the streets to protest the injustice. We found that black people in America were 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, that they were more likely to be unarmed. And interestingly, that the rates of police violence varied significantly depending on where you were. So in some cities, you had extraordinarily high rates of police violence. Places like in St. Louis, where the protest started, a black man in St. Louis is twice as likely to be killed by a police officer as the average American is to be killed by anyone, civilian or police, twice as high as the US murder rate. In Phoenix last year, one of the largest cities in the country, 1 in every 5 homicides was committed by police. In Albuquerque, it was 1 in 3. In Oklahoma City, it was 1 in 6. In the city that I'm from, Orlando, Florida, had the 2nd highest rate of police violence in the country. But what we also found was that there were cities that had lower rates. Cities where things were happening differently in terms of how police were interacting with communities. Places like Irvine, California, which was the only city of the 100 largest cities in the country where police had not killed anyone from 2013 through 18. Cities like Buffalo, New York, which had similar demographics as Orlando, Florida, and some of the cities that I mentioned, similar crime rates, but had much lower rates of police violence. So we wanted to understand, now that we had the data to map this across the country, we could start asking different questions about why some of the places that I mentioned earlier had such high rates of police violence, what was going on in those places, and what was happening that was going right in some of the cities that I mentioned. And so we collaborated with local organizations across the country to obtain the policy documents of those police departments. We wanted to understand every single factor that was at play contributing to these rates of police violence, whether it was the use of force policies of the police departments. These are the policies that determine how and when local police departments are authorized to use force. So unlike in many countries in Europe where there's a single standard governing police use of force, in the United States, there's not a federal standard. Each state has its own standard. Some states actually have not adopted a state law establishing a standard on when police can use force, including deadly force. So city by city, you could have completely different rules on how and when police could use force. So we investigated that. For the 100 largest cities in the country, we obtained the use of force documents of those police departments. And in looking through those documents, what we found was that the rules were so different, and not only that, but the rules mattered in explaining how likely it was that police would actually kill somebody. So just a couple of more statistics about this issue, because we won't often talk about accountability. So not only were we finding that so many people were being killed by police, but we were also finding that when police officers killed somebody in the United States, it was exceedingly rare for those officers to be held accountable by the criminal justice system. So in 97% of all cases where a police officer kills somebody, they are not charged with any crime. In 99% of cases, they're not convicted of a crime. And when they are convicted of a crime, they receive a lesser sentence than a civilian convicted of the exact same crime. So there's a case in Georgia, for example, where a police officer killed an unarmed black man. And for the first time in that state's history, the judge allowed somebody to serve a part-time jail sentence, specifically mentioning that because he was a police officer, he only had to serve jail time during the weekends. So these are some of the rates that I talked about of police violence, right? So you can see different cities, St. Louis and Orlando and Oklahoma City at the top with the highest rates of police violence, but also some of the cities that have lower rates. And then what you can also see to your right, this is a chart visualizing unarmed people killed by police in major American cities during this time frame, 2013 through 18. And what you can see here, it's color-coded by race. So the red squares are unarmed black people killed by police, the orange squares are unarmed Latinos killed by police, and the gray squares are unarmed white people killed by police. So what you can see here quite clearly is that almost every unarmed person killed by a police officer in major American cities is a person of color, the majority of whom are black. That's who's impacted by this issue. So wanted to also use the data to unpack and debunk some of the narratives that have allowed police violence to continue unabated for so many years. I mentioned that 1,200 people were killed by police in 2014. That's the same for 2015 and 2016 and 2017 and 2018. It's also the same for 2013 before the movement began and before there was so much national attention on this issue. And one of the narratives that is sought to justify police violence is a narrative about crime, a narrative that goes something like this: that police officers are using deadly force, particularly in black communities, because they're encountering violent criminals and having to defend themselves using any means possible from harm. That's the narrative that you hear. You turn on conservative media in the United States, that's what you hear. Now, that narrative isn't supported by the facts. And the police, up until recently, haven't had to actually defend that narrative because the data hadn't been collected to disprove it. But we collected the data, and we tested the narrative, and what you see is it doesn't bear out. So the red squares here are rates of police violence for the 60 largest cities in the country, and the blue X's are the violent crime rates. So what you see here is quite clearly that the violent crime rates are not correlated with the rates of police violence. There are cities with very high violent crime rates that have relatively low rates of police violence. There are cities with high rates of police violence that have relatively low rates of violent crime. So something else is explaining why the police are using this level of force in particular places. And as I said earlier, a lot of that has to do with the policies and practices of those police departments. And so in obtaining all of these policy documents, the use of force policies, the policies on training, information about the oversight structures that are investigating misconduct within those departments, information on police militarization, how many military weapons, assault weapons, tanks are police departments receiving from the Department of Defense. By the way, in the US under the 1033 program, a police department can apply to receive these types of weapons, including military aircraft, grenade launchers, tanks, assault weapons, free of charge. All they have to pay is shipping and handling to have this shipped from the military to the police department to use in any way that they see fit. And in doing that, I'll give you an example of how we evaluated these policies and connected them to this issue. So, use of force policies. As I said, each police department has its own use of force policy. This is designed and developed locally, and it's informed often by state law, but it goes above and beyond state law in many cases. So when we looked through these policies, what we saw was that the language was very different, depending on where you were. And so here are two examples. This is San Jose in California. It's a city of about 1 million people. This is their use of force policy. I'm just going to read it word for word. Officers need not retreat or desist in the reasonable use of force. There is no requirement that officers use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive one. That's the policy. So compare that with Philadelphia. It is important for first responding officers to use caution, evaluate the situation, attempt to de-escalate the situation through communication, request a crisis intervention team trained officer, that's an officer trained in how to interact with folks who are in a mental health crisis. If not personally trained, wait for backup and await the arrival of a patrol supervisor before taking any action, barring a threat to life. Retreating or repositioning is not a sign of weakness or cowardice by an officer. It is often a tactically superior police procedure rather than the immediate use of force. Only the minimal amount of force necessary to protect life or effect an arrest should be used by an officer. And then finally, at the end, the policy on deadly force. The application of deadly force is a measure to be employed only in the most extreme circumstances after all lesser means of force have failed or could not reasonably be employed. This is the opposite policy, right? So we go back to San Jose. Officers need not retreat, need not desist, no requirement to use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive force option. But in Philadelphia, they are very much required to do so. So the question is, how much does this actually matter? I mean, these are words on a piece of paper. How do they influence police officers' behaviors on the street? So in comparing the rates of deadly force that I showed you in each city to the types of restrictions in their use of force policies. So this is a grid mapping 8 different types of restrictions that we found in those policies. So for example, does the policy require officers to use de-escalation? Does the policy ban chokeholds and strangleholds? Does it require officers to give a verbal warning before shooting somebody? Does it ban officers from shooting at moving vehicles, a practice that even the Department of Justice, even police organizations say is exceedingly dangerous and unhelpful because if you hit the driver, the car then becomes unguided and can run into a crowd? Does it require officers to intervene and stop another officer if they witness them using excessive force? Does it require officers to exhaust all other means before using deadly force, right, like I showed you in Philadelphia? Well, it turns out most police departments didn't have the majority of these. So the average was 3 of these 8 restrictions among police departments, among the 100 largest departments in the country. And even for common sense things like requiring de-escalation whenever possible, only about 40% of police departments have that policy. Requiring officers to, limiting deadly force to be a last resort after other options are used. That only about 40% of police departments had that as a policy. Well, it turns out all of those policies predicted significantly lower rates of deadly force. So much so that those departments that required de-escalation were 15% less likely to kill people. Departments that required officers to exhaust all other means before using deadly force were 25% less likely to kill people. And the combination of these policies being put in place actually produced the largest reductions in police violence. So moving from 0 of these policies to adopting all 8, statistically, that was associated with a 72% reduction in killings by police. This is huge. And as I said, few departments had these in place. Only one department, San Francisco, has all 8 of these policies in place. So that's using the data to identify solutions, identify policies that have a base of evidence of being effective in a space that lacked all of this. I mean, we're talking about a field of criminology that was spending billions of dollars. You had almost every academic institution had a criminology department where folks were learning essentially how to use police as a strategy to address crime. Now, first of all, policing is not the most effective approach to crime. If you look at the research literature, it's investments in communities. It is community-based approaches that involve community-based organizations, community-based first responders, conflict de-escalators, mental health responders, investing in substance abuse prevention and mental health treatment that are most effective at addressing crime. But forget all of that. The reality is they weren't investing any money in how to actually stop police from committing crimes. How to stop police from engaging and participating in the violence. And so that's the research that we've been doing. Now, taking that research, visualizing it, understanding what are the components that predict police violence, and also what are the components that can help hold officers accountable to enforcing these standards. So it's one thing to adopt stronger use of force policies. It's another thing to make sure that they're actually enforced by police departments. To enforce them, it requires dealing with a whole host of additional systemic issues. So part of this investigation was uncovering things that were often hiding in plain sight. Things like police union contracts, which don't sound sexy. They don't sound like, when we talk about police violence in the United States, we're often talking about training, we're talking about investments in police departments, we're talking about use of force, we're talking about body cameras. We're not talking about police union contracts. But it turns out when we looked through those contracts, there were a host of things in those contracts that had been negotiated over the years that had made it exceedingly difficult to actually discipline a police officer for misconduct. So for example, in Cleveland, where the police killed Tamir Rice, they have a provision in their contract that requires all records of police discipline to be destroyed after 2 years. So you think about a police officer with a record of misconduct, and what we know when we look at the data is that there are often a smaller number of police officers, like was mentioned, that are responsible for huge and egregious acts of misconduct that are repeated over the years. So in Columbus, Ohio, for example, 6% of the police officers on the force were responsible for half of all use of force incidents. 6% of the officers, half of use of force incidents. But because of these provisions in the contract, they were actually purging those records systematically, so we couldn't figure out who those officers were. Not only that, but in cases where you were able to figure out which officers they were, you did discipline them, you did fire them, In the contract, they had clauses that allowed those officers to get their job back, plus back pay, by appealing through arbitration, where essentially they could select a lawyer to review the case that had full power to reinstate them regardless of what the city decides. So in places like San Antonio, Texas, 70% of all officers who are fired end up getting their jobs back through that single provision in the contract. So that's the system. We had to investigate and unpack the elements of the system that were creating and perpetuating this crisis year over year over year at the same rates. So how do we actually address this? Now that we understand the problem, we're starting to understand the components of it and the solutions in terms of policy and practice. How do we adopt those in a context and in a country where there are 18,000 different police departments, each with their own leadership, each with their own policies and practices, each with their own culture and funding sources? Well, to do that, it's bigger than any one organization or collaborative. I mean, we've been in rooms with the president, with presidential candidates. We've been in rooms with state and local leaders, but we can't be in every room, nor should we be. The way that you're able to address this issue is by digitally being able to make this information so accessible that any community, any person can find this information on their own, can evaluate their own police department, can access the data and the policy information that they need to walk into those rooms with their mayor, with their city council member, with their state legislator, and be just as effective in pushing for policy change as any one of us. And so that's the work that we sought to do. So for example, one way that we were able to do this was by launching a digital survey on Twitter. So much of what I've showed you, we've actually used Twitter as the way to communicate it. As a strategy of getting around many of the institutions that have often sought to block or delay or slow or not fund the work that needed to get done. So by launching this survey on Twitter, it asked people very simple questions. People who wanted to get involved in doing the work to address police violence were asked how many hours a week they had to contribute, what types of work they wanted to do. So did they want to help collect data? Did they want to review policy? Did they want to engage in protest? Did they want to track legislation? Did they want to meet with legislators? And then they were asked, what type of background do you have in this work? So we had data scientists who signed up. We had designers and developers. We had everyday folks, right? Folks who were cashiers, folks who had never done this work before, who wanted to get involved in this, and we trained them in how to do this. And in launching the survey, we signed up 18,000 people in 2 weeks across the country. And those were the people who helped review all of the policies that I showed you. Those were the people who designed and developed and published the data visualizations that I showed you. Those were the people that have sat in city hall meetings and in meetings with mayors and legislators across the country to push for policy change. So by creating a system where we made this as accessible as possible, we were able to achieve a reality where we could see policy change in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously with virtually no resources. And we've seen policy change. So we track legislation in every state and in the largest cities in the country. Since 2014, there have been 40 states that have signed legislation to do something to address police violence. Now, this looks great. It's not wonderful because oftentimes, as I've said, there are many aspects to this. It requires doing more than just changing the use of force policy. You have to make sure you're adopting accountability structures to enforce those policies. It means more than doing training, but you're also making sure that the officers in those trainings who don't perform are held accountable. But nevertheless, this is a substantial increase from the period before 2014. Before 2014, every single year we saw maybe 1 or 2 states do something about police violence. Since then, we've seen the majority of states take action. And in some states, they have taken comprehensive action. In places like Illinois, they've changed the state's deadly force standard. They've banned chokeholds. They have adopted a police misconduct database. In places like New Jersey, they've launched a nationwide or a statewide police misconduct database, and they have also created a mechanism for officers who have committed misconduct not to be rehired. Same thing in Connecticut. We've seen independent investigations and prosecutions laws passed in places like Texas, in places like New Jersey, in places like Connecticut and New York. So progress is being made. But we're just at the beginning. So when we see communities that have changed laws to address police violence, Now we're able to track the results of that. Because we can track the data over time in terms of people who've been shot by police, people who've been killed by police, those places that have adopted new use of force policies, that have passed legislation, have significantly fewer police shootings today than they had before. Those are lives saved. So the challenge is less so figuring out what to do. It's about how do we scale what's working to every single one of the 18,000 police jurisdictions in the United States. To do that requires a distributed organizing methodology. It requires the ability to visualize and tell stories that empower everyday people to walk into those chambers of state legislatures, to walk into those city councils, and be just as effective in advocating for these types of changes as any one of us could be. And we're seeing that work city by city, state by state. But again, there are 104 million Americans, according to Pew Research survey, who currently support the Black Lives Matter movement. 104 million Americans. You'll recall that Donald Trump got, I think, 60 million votes. Hillary Clinton got 63 million votes. And yet, 104 million people. And we've, at best, only scratched the surface, only scratched a fraction of that number and involved them in this work, and yet and still we're able to see results. So the question and the challenge for all of us, not only in the United States but across the world, is how do we design, through technology, through our storytelling, through our journalism and investigations, how do we design those with an intent to make them accessible to as many people as possible so that we can reach this scale? Not only on police violence and criminal justice reform, but this is an issue that is in common with so many issues. You look at climate change. How many billions of people across the world care about climate change and are affected by it? And yet, how many people are actively engaged in the work? Well, luckily today we've had 100,000 people in this city alone engaged in it. But that's the key. How do we keep involving more and more people, not only in the streets protesting, but engaged in the policy work, engaged in the research, engaged in holding legislators accountable in every single district across the country and across the world? That's the work that we have to do. And I think we've only just scratched the surface on what's achievable. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Next up, we have Gareth. Gareth Benest is a freelance participatory video practitioner with 16 years experience in development communications. Gareth began facilitating PV at ActionAid, working with survivors of communal violence and street children in India. He's since delivered projects around the world, engaging diverse communities to explore and document a range of issues. He was director of programs for InsightShare for 10 years and has written 3 guidebooks on community engagement, rights-based advocacy, and social accountability. His current work engages citizens affected by the grand corruption and human rights abuses of the former regime in the Gambia, working in partnership with Transparency International. And I believe we're going to see an extract from that project, which is the kind of premiere of that work that we've been producing together. So, Gareth, if you're ready, over to you.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to everyone that's been involved in getting me here. I really appreciate being invited here. I'm not sure how much I appreciate being asked to follow those 2 presentations, though. That was extraordinary, both of you. Thank you. I'll do my best to follow it, but I'm not sure I can. Thank you, Michael. Yes, I'm Gareth. As you've probably already noticed, I'm from the UK. And I'm a participatory video facilitator. And I'm going to present a project which is very recent, very live. I've just come back last month from the Gambia, where I was working on this project. And I'm going to share some extracts from what was delivered there in the Gambia. And first I'm going to start to tell you a little bit more about what I mean by participatory video. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the term, but for those of you that aren't, please bear with me. So participatory video is essentially, it's a bit closer? I thought, okay. How's that? Is that better? Okay, all right. Participatory video is a community engagement, community development tool. It's been around for a little bit over 40 years. And it's been practiced in probably as many different ways as there are different people practicing it. As I say, it's an approach, it's a technique for engaging groups and for enabling them to analyze their own issues, to explore their own circumstances, and for them to communicate with their chosen audiences. And certainly in the way that it's mostly practiced, it's a way of supporting groups to bring about positive change to the situations that they're facing. Participants, the group that take part in the process, do so typically as representatives of their communities, in inverted commas. That could be a geographic community, it could be a village or a city, an urban or a rural area, or it might be as communities of interest or of experience. And they come together, they're typically selected, chosen by organizers and by facilitators as representatives of the group that is being supported. The participants work together to understand the issues that they're facing, to explore their circumstances, and to decide what they want to say. To decide what they want to say and to whom they want to say it, and to practice telling their stories to each other, and then, if that's what they choose, to outsiders. We as facilitators, I as a facilitator, am there to support the group, both in exploring and understanding those issues, but also in learning the skills necessary for them to communicate with their audience. So we use video, and we support the group to learn the skills necessary to make films through playing, through games, through exercises. It is a non-didactic learning experience. It's experiential. So there's no lessons, there's no teaching in that sense. We pass the camera around. As a facilitator, I'm the last person to touch the camera, if at all. And we do everything we can to demystify the technology and to allow people to engage with it without fear, without barrier, and to learn. And they learn very, very rapidly in this way. A group who will never have held a camera before, often who will never held a pen before, can be making really quite sophisticated films within a matter of days, a little over a week sometimes, just through playing and being really hands-on. So those participants work together, they devise, they develop the communication that they want to make, the messages that they want to share. They devise them, as I say, they direct them, they film them, and wherever possible, they edit them. It's not always possible, but wherever possible. Excuse me. So, video in this way is a communication team, a communication tool to allow that group, those participants, to begin a dialogue with their chosen audience. So I'll briefly just run through some of the sort of characteristics of participatory video, as I should caveat, as I practice it, as I understand it. So it is using video as a tool for change, as I said, for positive change. It's process-centered, and by that I mean I'm, as a facilitator or as people initiating this sort of project, I'm interested in what happens during the process much more than I am interested in the product, in the final output, the final film that's created. It's very often the process itself which brings about the most interesting changes. As I said before, it's founded on experiential learning. And as part of that, we follow a sort of learning pattern, which is we act, we reflect, and we react. And so we're constantly looking at what we're doing and reacting to what we've done. It supports equal participation, so no one person becomes a camera operator, no one person becomes a sound recordist. Everyone does everything. And we strongly encourage a group of 12 people to rotate roles and to equally participate in everything that we do. The outputs are owned by the participants. They control what they say, to whom they say it, how they say it, and what happens with it thereafter. And in this way, we try to support groups to represent themselves. And for want of a better word, for particularly the most marginalized groups and communities around the world, this can be a unique opportunity to actually seize control of how they're represented. Okay, so that was probably not as brief as it ought to have been, but an introduction to participatory video. So Transparency International, I've worked with many times over recent years on participatory video projects, and this most recent one is looking at grand corruption in the Gambia. Grand corruption, Transparency International defines as the abuse of high-level power that benefits the few at the expense of the many and causes serious and widespread harm to individuals and society. So we were tasked with looking at, using participatory video to look at the maladministration in the Gambia. So the Gambia was independent from Britain in 1965. Yahya Jammeh, at the age of 29, seized power in a coup in 94. And he ruled as a dictator for 22 years. He swore to rule for 1 billion years. And those 22 years were characterized by an extraordinary litany of human rights abuses and repression. He was ousted in an election defeat in 2016, and eventually he escaped to Equatorial Guinea in January 2017. So this is very recent past. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the situation in the Gambia, with the legacy of Yahya Jammeh. Certainly, it doesn't seem that it has been very high on the agenda for many people around the world, as you can see from some of these quotes. I like that. Gambia wasn't even a back burner issue, it was a backwater issue. Gambia is the smallest mainland country in Africa. It has 2 million people population. It is surrounded by Senegal, and it is, its struggles are considered to be backwater issues. So Jammeh's grand corruption, there's a fantastic series of reports by the OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, on the corruption in the Gambia. Jammeh and his associates stole just shy of $1 billion during those 22 years. How much of that $1 billion found its way into Jammeh's pockets is unknown, but he lived a really very lavish lifestyle. And that money was drawn from state institutions, and that included the state pension, housing, disability, the Social Security fund. Here you can see a breakdown of where he got all that money from. State-run telecoms, he stole 363 million from, foreign aid 100 million, etc. So the rationale for bringing myself in and for undertaking this project was there is what's known as the TRRC, which is ongoing, the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission. And it's quite an extraordinary truth and reconciliation process by all accounts, but the voices of the marginalized, the voices of rural and impoverished citizens are not being heard within that process. So participatory video was introduced here to facilitate dialogue and to mobilize the citizens of the Gambia to push back against corruption, to push back against grand corruption, but also, importantly, to push back against the low-level corruption that is coming in now that Jammeh isn't there. He had a stranglehold on the country such that people didn't really notice corruption happening. They weren't being bribed. There wasn't petty bribes happening in their lives. Now it is. Now he's gone. Now that petty level corruption is coming in. So these were the 10 participants that joined the process. We had 2 survivors of a student protest. There was a student protest in April 10 and 11 in the year 2000. 2 of the participants were involved in that process and were shot. We have farmers. We have a former member of the judiciary. We have 2 members of a community who were forcefully evicted from their village. The entire village was forcefully evicted and are now refugees in Senegal. We have pensioners who lost their pensions. We have midwives who work in extraordinary conditions. And we have farmers. So we worked for 8 days in a residential workshop. Then we did 3 days of field work. We had 2 groups that went out in different parts of the country, and then we came back and edited the film that they had made. This is a map of where we went as a group. As you see, we covered a large part of the Gambia. And I'm going to stop talking, I think, and show you these extracts from the film, because it'll give you a much better sense of what they did than I can. So I just finished on Wednesday, I just finished the rough cut of the film, and it's 30-odd minutes, so I'm not going to make you watch 30-odd minutes. So I've thrown together some extracts, so this is really rough. You really have to bear with me. You're the first people, other than myself, my dog, and I think my wife, that have seen any of this outside of the Gambia, and it was a very closed process, so only a dozen people or so have seen any of this. It's still rough, so bear with me, but this will give you a sense, I hope, of what they've been doing, of what they made, and of what they wanted to say.
So, thanks, Gareth. So I have a couple of questions before we open it up to the floor. It seems like, so between Sam and Gareth's approaches, it's almost kind of diametrically opposed for all the things that they have in common. One is completely data-driven, one is based on, individual human experience. And in anti-corruption, we often look for those human stories in order to be able to make the numbers, that nearly $1 billion figure, real to people to kind of spur change. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, each of you, on what are the conditions when your approaches come into play? When are they effective? What needs to be there for there to be impact from the approaches that you each take?
So I think it depends, right? For my work, it has been recognizing that in the ecosystem that I had operated in, there already was a strong telling of stories. We were seeing the videos. We were seeing the families who were directly impacted by police violence. We were seeing people take to the streets and tell their stories of what had happened. The gap was around data. The federal government wasn't collecting the data. There was no data. And that's why that was the work that I chose to do, because you needed to have both. Some people respond to different audiences. Probably more people respond to the emotional argument, the individual stories, being able to identify with the person who is impacted, seeing themselves in that person, seeing their son or daughter in that person, and connecting with them in that way. I think that's probably the most powerful connection that you can forge. But for some people respond to the numbers. Some people they want to see the numbers, they want to see the data, they want to see the trends before they make a decision, particularly policymakers, particularly people in positions of institutional power. They, especially in the United States, have dismissed stories from marginalized communities for so long. They've dismissed them as isolated incidents or the fault of the people who were coming to them. A lot of that was racism, right? And the data was a way of speaking a different language that was able to overcome some of those barriers, and especially convince the people in institutional positions who needed to be convinced in order to implement some of these changes.
Gareth, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about it, I have to say, Michael. corruption's a really difficult one for this kind of work. And I think the most important thing we need is patience for people to really understand how corruption fits into their experiences. And particularly something which, as I said, this is grand corruption. This was very high level and quite abstract level of corruption, which had massively impacted upon all of the participants that were with us, but they didn't necessarily at that point quite realize the link between that grand corruption and the fact that they didn't have a pension or that their health center is utterly impoverished, or they've been evicted from their community. So for the sort of work that I'm doing, we need a lot of time. Thankfully in the Gambia, these issues are still also paramount in everyone's minds. So everyone's thinking about the legacy of Jammeh, everyone's thinking about what he did to the country, and it's very live, very raw, so people are ready to talk about it and are able to talk about it. That's not always been the case with some of the corruption-focused participatory video work we've done, but we've always had a lot more time under those circumstances, so I think that's really important.
Okay. Melissa, I want to come back to this, the personal connection that you have to the story you're covering. As far as I know, that doesn't feature in the reporting. Earlier in Roberto's talk, he was talking about making oneself the character in the story that you're telling. Do you feel that, is it because of the format, the publication, is that something that you'd be looking to do, that you're interested in doing? I mean, it's incredibly powerful to hear that personal connection. What are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is, in terms of the investigation that we were doing, I needed to stay out of it in terms of the forum, because of course we were trying, I needed to stay out of the way of that story as much as possible and let it be actually fully focused on two things. Number one, I think, three things. Number one for me was framing it to make sure that these voices that had lived, who had been screaming in the dark forever, these women, were heard first and foremost. That was critically important to me, that they were the heroes of their own story. Number two, of course, we needed to focus on the egregious actions, not only of one particular officer, because that's ultimately what the story is not. The story is not about one particular officer. It's about the institutions that very much failed to intervene. And I needed that to, maybe those two things, to be front and center. And so I didn't want any sort of distraction from that. But in the process of writing the book, it's something that is included in a foreword and an afterword to help provide a little bit more context. But again, I just didn't want anything in a very strictly American sense of like just the facts and nothing but the facts, ma'am, to be distracting in any way from the narrative we were telling.
You mentioned the institutions failing to do their job. I think quite early on in this story, there was an official report commissioned by the mayor that highlighted a lot of these issues, and it seems kind of inconceivable, but it said certain people are almost definitely innocent of the crimes they're in jail for, the murders they're in jail for, yet nothing could take place as a result of that. What was that about?
This independent report actually was far along in the game. I think it was commissioned in 2013 by the city of Chicago, and it very much wasn't a fact-finding expedition. It was very much a risk assessment, and those are two very different things. I think they were trying to figure out how many millions of dollars will they ultimately be on the hook to pay. And despite that, despite their findings, I think it was in at least against 5 defendants that they were or 5 inmates at that time that they were most likely innocent. The sort of judicial apparatus, particularly in the form of prosecutors, continued to fight their exonerations until the very last minute. So that's sort of the institutional entrenchment that we have. when it comes to letting people walk free, because of course the financial liability that accompanies that. Some of the exonerees from this particular, there have been 2 who've been awarded, one $21 million from the city of Chicago and another $17 million. And there are 11 other men who have been exonerated in this time, and they all have civil lawsuits pending. So there's a lot of money at stake in doing the right thing.
Sam, in your presentation, you were talking about the fact that you were collecting this data for the first time and making these comparisons between policy and their impact. Do you have a sense, or have you ever talked to people in government about why this wasn't happening, why they weren't gathering this?
Well, part of it was methodological. So the federal government was using a methodology where they were relying on all 18,000 police departments across the country to report data on people that they had killed every single year in a reliable and consistent and timely way. Now, the problem with that is that there was no enforcement mechanism. There was a minor enforcement mechanism. They could withhold, I believe it was 5% of federal funding to a department that refused to comply with that, but they had never used that enforcement mechanism. And 5% of federal funding is a very tiny percent of the overall funding of a police department because most of it is local and state. So essentially the methodology the federal government was using was not up to the task of actually collecting comprehensive data. And so their official numbers were something like 460 people killed by police each year. That was the number that they actually collected through that methodology. As we found, the number was about 3 times higher than that. So part of the reason that I was able to figure out a way around this was because of 2 crowdsourced databases that existed at the time. One's called fatalencounters.org, the other was killbypolice.net. These were groups of people who woke up every single day. They had a system of Google alerts on their computer, and every time that a news article mentioning officer-involved shooting, police shooting, a series of keywords was mentioned, they would take that article and log it. So it would just be a spreadsheet with dates and in some cases names and then a link to an article. And these spreadsheets just sort of existed online. They were floating around online. Nobody had really looked at them. Then 538.com in 2014 did an article where they audited those databases. And they said, well, these databases are 100% accurate. And by the way, these databases have 3 times as many records combined as the federal government's estimate. Then the Human Rights Data Analysis Group did an analysis where they did a multiple systems analysis, where they were able to look at the degree of overlap between those databases. And by estimating the degree of overlap between those 2 databases, they could actually estimate the total universe of people killed by police, including people not included in either database. And their final total was 1,200 people killed by police each year. So that means that these spreadsheets online had those records, but they hadn't been merged together, so each spreadsheet had unique records that the other did not have. There was information that hadn't been coded, so whether the person was armed or unarmed, the race of the person, all of these things that were critical to doing any of these analyses were missing. So the task was building on the field that the work that had been done, right? There was work to find these articles, to develop a methodology to do this, but it hadn't gotten to the point where it could actively be used in service of understanding the issue fully and making a difference on it. So the work was merging those databases, figuring out how we can get those additional pieces of information in collaboration with local organizations, looking at what the information online on obituaries and social media accounts to be able to identify folks by race, to be able to identify whether they were armed or unarmed, to be able to then take that data and make it actionable and accessible and useful. So that was where a lot of the work needed to be done. Since doing that, now we've seen major media organizations, the Washington Post, the Guardian, have taken that methodology and built databases as well. We've seen the federal government now has said that they are implementing a similar methodology to collect this data, although they have not fully collected or reported any of it yet, and they've been saying that for years. But it's changing the way that the field is doing this. And before this, you had either the federal government's incomplete database or you had records from an individual police department that you couldn't really compare to other departments. So that's where the data is moving, and I think now, we're talking about people killed by police, which is why we can rely in large part on local media reports, because it's a homicide, it usually gets reported. It gets reported about 98% of the time, according to research estimates. But when we talk about other forms of police violence, non-lethal force, police using a taser against somebody, punching somebody, those don't get reported in the media very often. So part of the challenge is how do we expand from the tip of the iceberg, the most egregious incidents, to also being able to gather data on non-lethal force, on all of these other forms of police interaction and police violence that are much more frequent and that also need to be addressed.
Are there any questions from the audience? Let's move to that.
My question is for Samuel, and I'm just, maybe for Samuel and for Melissa, I'm just wondering, because you guys had so many different people involved in your, as collaborators. So Samuel, you said you had 18,000 people who signed up from Twitter. So I'm just wondering what kind of software or platforms you would use just to, collect all of that or to be in contact. Because it's actually quite a hard thing, I imagine, so many different collaborators.
Yeah, it is very hard. We haven't done it, we haven't perfected this. It's, I think, very difficult. This is how we did it. When people signed up online, we added them to a Slack group. If you're not familiar with Slack, it's like a project management system. It's fairly easy to use. And we created different groups for each state, groups for particular types of work. So data collection was like a group, policy review, and then really through Google Sheets, Slack. A lot of these are off-the-shelf solutions. We had no funding for this work. At the time, 2014-15, funders were not interested in funding this work. They still haven't really funded this work. They funded maybe 1 or 2 organizations in the space. And so a lot of this was off-the-shelf solutions. So the visualizations, we used Tableau for a lot of visualizations. We got the free trial version, and then after that it was maybe $50 a month. Use Carto for the map. That was a free trial version, ended up being $30 a month after that. Google Sheets for inputting information collaboratively, and then I would review everything. We had a team of folks who were legal experts, policy experts who helped review the content, and then for volunteers that were contributing a lot of content, we ended up promoting them to be able to manage other groups of volunteers. So it was a very decentralized process. I don't think that we've perfected it because of those 18,000 people, it's a smaller proportion that have been consistently engaged, right? So, people may have signed up, but maybe they didn't really want to work 5 hours a week, or maybe we haven't found the most effective way of engaging them. So I think that this is an emerging science, community management, which, when doing this type of work is really, really critical to being able to do, to being able to learn from, and to build an infrastructure over time that can sustain, right? Because the other part of this is if you're relying on volunteers, maybe their interest wanes. Maybe they were really passionate about this issue in 2015, but by 2016 you had an election where the country's politics fundamentally changed. Now we're dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. We've got immigration, we've got climate change, we've got general corruption of the Trump administration. Every single day there are 3 or 4 impeachable offenses and crises that we're dealing with. So it's hard to manage in that context, right? It's information overload. So part of this is evolving over time to build that infrastructure, figuring out how to sustain it, and really trying to build the plane as we're flying it.
Other questions? Wait for the microphone 1 sec.
How many people were working with you to really manage all the volunteers also? Because we sometimes have that issue, there's people who want to help, but to really have a system of managing the volunteers in a meaningful way, that nobody feels bad, that things don't drop down, that, it's not really easy, but it sounds so easy. You managed thousands of people's input. Just to hear a bit more how you did that.
Yeah, it's not easy. I think, so we had, let me think about this. we had about 100 people who were like really consistently engaged, that we were able to get other people to help manage other people. And then what I would do, so we would focus on a manageable set of tasks. So the 100 largest cities would be the focus area. So within that, you're talking about 100 contributions, right, from people in each city. So reviewing the 100 contributions is not impossible, right? You don't need a huge team for that. But then the challenge becomes for new people who are signing up within those cities, how are we giving them meaningful work? We've reviewed the policies of the city, but we want to engage people in the advocacy. So we developed a tool, I didn't show you this in the slide, but there's a tool that we developed that made it very easy for people to contact their city council members, their mayors, and state representatives. So you put in your zip code, it shows you all of your representatives and all of the votes that they've taken on these bills, and then allows you to call them or email them, and the whole process takes 3 clicks or less. So by making the tool very easy, where people could just immediately know how to use it, there was a script, I mean, they could get involved immediately. We had 100,000 people use the tool to contact their representatives. So part of it was just in the design of the tool, making it very self-explanatory, making it very easy. We're actually working on something now that takes that model and builds on it. So you put in the information that I talked about, and a lot of the what you want to do, your background, where you're located, how many hours a week, and we'll automatically place you in something that you can do without needing to go through me or somebody else to onboard you. So I think that's where we want to go, is to be able to automate pieces of this, but still make it personal, still not make people feel disconnected, but I think we have to learn how to automate more of this to get to scale.
I think there was another question in the same row.
Thank you. Melissa, Gareth, you helped individuals and communities to tell a story in the face of quite powerful interests, whether that was the police or whether that was a state with endemic corruption. And I wonder if there was concerns from the people that you worked with about retribution, about the repercussions, and if so, what lessons would you have for others that are trying to help tell stories in the face of significant power dynamics?
Yeah, I was asked about this a little bit earlier, and I'm still reflecting on it. We did a lot of work to try to understand what the risks might be to the participants before we undertook the project. And the local partners went through a long risk assessment process. But I'm still not completely sure that I know. For the majority of the participants, I would say probably for 8 or 9 out of the 11, I don't think there is significant risk, and most of them were talking about issues which are legacy issues. So they are to do with the reign of Jammeh, and there's unlikely to be any risk or retribution that comes back from what they're talking about. The ones that were from the community in Kermot Hali that have been forcefully evicted and have crossed over into Senegal, they were themselves very confident that they wanted to speak out and they would accept the risks. And everyone that spoke on the film, we go through a very long process of developing informed consent. So the majority of the people that spoke on the film were the participants themselves, but there were other contributors. And we spent a lot of time working with people to actually explore what they're consenting to, and that includes the risks. But there is potentially risk there for members of that community because the government has moved a paramilitary unit into their village that they were forced out of to prevent them from going back after the High Court found that they should be allowed to return to their village and nobody should stand in their way. So that's a very live case, and yes, there is a risk. The short answer, the really honest answer is, with this kind of work, it isn't always suited to those kinds of scenarios where there's a high risk to people speaking out. Participatory video is essentially an overt process it doesn't lend itself to covert filming. And so what people say and who says it needs to be seen and visible and needs to be open. And so I think we're pushing at the boundaries of where I feel comfortable with this kind of work. And probably the limits of what participatory video can do in this kind of environment. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Tom, but I've done my best.
I think Gareth hit it pretty squarely when he said developing informed consent for your subject matters. Those are very long conversations, and I think that's part of what I was talking about when saying, that working out, for me, working out sort of like post-story considerations during the fact-checking process, when I know exactly what's going to be in the piece and how it's going to appear. For somebody who might be in harm's way, I feel it's incredibly important for them to know when it's going to appear, more or less what it's going to say, so that they are able to take whatever steps are necessary for them. During the interview process, of course, we sort of brainstorm, and a lot of times they know those risks better than I do. And in some cases, they're informing me of what those risks are for them more than I am, brainstorming all the horrible things that could happen to them. I mean, a lot of times they're keenly aware of that in a way that I'm not. In terms of reporters themselves, though, I mean, there are definitely dangers. I mean, there are times you're walking up saying, hey, I know that this person didn't murder him, but I'm talking to you because I think you did. Not always a comfortable conversation. But those are risks, of course, that we all are willing to take. But I think that there are like practical things, like for example, I'll use like the geofencing tool if I'm going to a particular dangerous situation, so that, somebody back in my we do have a security team at BuzzFeed, and so they're able to monitor that. But there are also, I think, institutional powers. For example, I've been subpoenaed a number of times in the course of this as a way to threaten me to leave things alone. But I think anybody who's willing to do this work, knows the risks and, is okay with that.
Sam, what about yourself? Do you consider yourself putting yourself at risk by doing this kind of work?
Yeah. I've been put at risk. There are many different risks. One is security. So the good thing about enrolling so many people in this is you have a lot of people who are engaged and that you can work with and make impact. I mean, the bad thing is you don't really know who these people are, right? I mean, they're signing up online. It's very hard to verify that you can trust people who sign up online to do something. And so just the design of these digital groups where people are doing work is structured so like not everybody has access to all the channels. Like you have to keep these lines so that one person can't corrupt the entire ecosystem. There are personal risks as well. I've been threatened, I've been doxxed. My address has been like doxxed before I had to move. I've been visited by the FBI, all kinds of stuff. And I'm not the only activists within the movement who had that happen, right? There have been dozens of people, and that was under the Obama administration. That's not even, the Trump administration is 10 times worse. So, these are the risks, right? And they're not unique. I mean, they're not unique to our period in time. They're not unique to the institutions that are doing it. These are things that have been around for quite some time in the context of Black activism in the United States. And those are the risks that, ultimately the work is about how do we, despite all of those risks, nevertheless not lose sight of the work that needs to happen and figure out a way to do it anyway. And I think that that's the only way that I know how to do it.
In the back there.
Thank you. I have a question about the continuity of these programs, or like the video, participatory video, or the article that you have wrote. That usually, like, you come from more privileged position than those people who we are helping, and we were able to give them like this amount maybe of fund or work to help them to raise their voices, but at some point all of this just stopped, and this continuity of their participatory or being able to express themselves just stopped. And usually these projects just face these problems that they are not able to continue, and they are not able to support those people to be to express themselves. How we can, or how do you think, or how have you managed to work on continuing on these projects?
Thanks. That's an issue I've grappled with for at least 13, 14 years, something like that. And those working in participatory video are not alone. I think the whole community media world has been through the whole sort of this process. And around 10 years ago or so, there was a big movement towards building community media units. Because there was this concern, built around this concern that we're giving a voice, we're, you know, for want of a better expression, we're undertaking this project, we're providing an opportunity for people to speak out, to express themselves, and then we're taking it away again at the end of the project. And so there was a whole movement, and I've spent many years building community media projects, community media hubs, as they were called. Most of my work has been with indigenous communities, setting up these kinds of participatory video units within various communities around the world. It's really challenging, and I'm kind of at the stage now where actually I'm not sure I believe in that anymore. You know, we brought this group of people together for a purpose. To explore an issue, to speak out about an issue, to reach an audience. The fact that that doesn't continue is not a problem for me anymore, because it suggests that it's a panacea, that giving people a video camera is an answer to all challenges that they face. And it just isn't. It absolutely isn't. It's like if participatory video facilitators are particularly prone to this. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? You know, you going around and say, oh, we'll use participatory video for that, we'll use participatory video. It was appropriate in these circumstances, I think, to do that project, because it enabled a group to speak to an audience. They don't need to make videos now. They don't need to. Maybe they do, but probably they don't. And I don't think that we need to build an edifice of a format, a structure, necessarily. There's groups that I'm working with, 5, 6, 7 years down the line, they're still making films, and they're making films on many different issues, and it's successful and it's important. But I don't think, I don't have that anxiety anymore. I really don't. I think it's fine. We made the film, and that's what we were there to do, and they don't need cameras, I think.
Melissa, would you like to respond? What happens when you move on to the next reporting project?
It's terrible. You feel guilty every time you open your inbox and you see, this morning I opened my inbox and I see another inmate's family reaching out and asking for help. And the reality is I write for a news media corporation and we're looking for things that are new. But I think though that it is important to not walk away from a story too soon. So anybody who does work sort of in a more corporate media structure, I encourage them to keep coming back. For example, it wasn't just the one story that we ran. We ran stories where we reached out to government officials. Did you see this? What is your response? How do you respond to your constituents? Like, that's the day 2 story. And then what's the day 3 story? And what's the day 4 story? To be able to keep your foot on the neck of people who should be held accountable for those things.
So that is something that I highly encourage, is not to think of it as, just sort of touching down and heading out. But it's also to keep those relationships. I still take a lot of phone calls from folks who I'm never going to write about again, but because there is a bond and there is a connection, we still keep that. But the one thing for anybody, again, who does work maybe in a more corporate structure is to figure out, themes and ways to keep just knocking on the door of whatever injustice that it is. Are there things thematically that you can group together that are going to connect with people in a way that resonate, and just, I don't know, I just keep grinding. That's the only answer I can give you is I just keep grinding. And it is really difficult right now. I'm working on immigration stories in the US, and I'm seeing people in tremendous financial need. And that is brutal because, in the American tradition, I am not allowed by, sort of the black letter of our ethical obligations to be able to support them. And those are very difficult and sometimes tricky moments. So I keep giving it back to you.
Any other questions?
Hi, I don't know if this was what she meant at all, but somehow I guess I interpreted it slightly different, which was because you're making, or like helping people to make films, but then, I guess in your case, maybe it's like for a very specific organization, and who knows if it will go out to the world, but I think the idea is that you empower people to create something, and then the faces of the people who are showing it at like festivals and things are generally like the white men or the white crew or whatever it is. And so it's less about like, let's keep a camera in their hands, and more about like not exploiting the people that you're creating something for. And like, is there a system set up, for example, that like, if the film would earn money or whatever the situation is, that it would go back to at least some of it to the community? Because I feel like that's just a kind of a narrative that keeps playing over and over, and I don't know, I don't know if that's what it was, but that's what I want to ask.
Yeah, again, I totally understand your concern. First of all, there's no money is made from any of these films. Secondly, like I said, you're not the audience, and I won't be touring festivals with this, or you may be the only audience outside of the Gambia to see it. I don't know. That's not what it's made for. But to answer your point, absolutely. In every possible circumstance that we can build into these projects, the people who show their films are the participants. The people who stand here, sit here, and talk about what they did, how they did it, and why they did it are the participants themselves. And I don't want to be doing that. That's, I'm happy to share it with you. I'm delighted to share it with you. But it would be much better if it were one of those 11 folks that were here and able to share it with you. So, I wholeheartedly agree with you that, and I don't want to be, profiting either directly or indirectly from being able to exploit their work and go around and say, look at, this wonderfully exotic film. I have no interest in that whatsoever. And I hope that's not what we're doing here. But I hope we're sharing a methodology and an example of what it does.
Yeah, and I think we're glad to have you here to share your work, as well as Sam and Melissa. So I think that's unfortunately all the time we have for questions. So big round of applause for our panelists, please.
So I'm also here to close, and just a second, Michael, because I wanted first to thank all of you. Thanks, was really important, your contribute, and I think, totally represent also our idea of citizen of evidence, and we will go on tomorrow also to discuss more on this. But also I wanted to tell you, because you are also doing an action for transparency at the moment, so if you just want to say 2 words about this, I think is important.
Sure, so there is currently a campaign in Berlin, which is to petition the municipal government to disclose their lobbying activities, how they spend their money. Essentially, everything that the government of Berlin does would be posted online, and then freely available for civil society, for media, for all of us to analyze and look for irregularities, signs of corruption. As you come in, on the desk there's a petition form which you can sign. We need to get 20,000 signatures in order for the Berlin Senate to debate this law and hopefully pass it. This is part of a broad coalition with, I think, about 50 different organizations in Berlin, including Open Knowledge, Mehr Democracy, Transparency International Germany, and others. The only caveat is you should be a German citizen registered in Berlin in order to sign the petition, so hopefully that doesn't rule out too many people here today. But the form is just as you come in on the ticket desk, so please do sign it if you're eligible. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So thank you very much. And we want to announce the program of tomorrow, but now, I mean, I also leave you the freedom of, to go away from the stage, not to be here listening to me. Thank you very much for your contribution. And I mean, we just want to briefly announce what is happening tomorrow and also after tomorrow, soon. Just since we were speaking about action of citizens, we had on the chairs when you arrive some little papers, and we are also asking you to give feedback about our topics, our program. So it would be really nice if you can give it at the entrance. If you don't have time to write it now, we hope you come back tomorrow, you compile your little paper and you give it to us, because we also think it's very important for the Disruption Lab to understand how you see this program and to have your feedback. And just briefly say what is happening tomorrow. We open the door at 3. And we will have the keynote with Matthew Caruana Galizia that is moderated by Krina Boros. And there we will also speak about the risks about the independent investigations and also what usually the independent investigation don't disclose. And we will also refer to the story of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the mother of Matthew Caruana Galizia that was assassinated in Malta because of reporting against corruption. And we already mentioned also our work in our conference in April about the Panama Papers. So it's really an important case, and I hope you are coming back to listen to this. Then we will have a panel that is also related to the tools and also to the idea of opening up data to citizens. We invited Emanuel Freudenthal and Brennan Novak and MC McGrath. Unfortunately, Natalia Sedeshka, that was supposed to be with us, had the family loss, and she won't be with us. We are really sorry about this, but yeah, we will go on with this panel, and we will discuss really how the citizen could make a change in working with the tools to open up data. And we finished the day with the forensic architecture investigation by Robert Trafford. And we will enter into the depth of open source investigation moderated by Laura Treffers. So with that, we conclude the day. And Sunday, we will have a workshop with Emanuel Freudenthal and Sector 035 about tracking dictators and unknown planes that are flying over Berlin. So we are going in a group also to do open source intelligence, working with do-it-yourself antennas to track the sky. I mean, hopefully you come back tomorrow. Otherwise, Lieke will also tell you about the following community program.
Yeah, so like we said in the beginning, we always do a community meetup after the conference to kind of follow up on everything we discussed and also dive a bit deeper into the topic. So we're going to have this meetup on the 2nd of October, and so Wednesday evening, and we invited the Syrian Archive for this, which is a really interesting platform that's working also here in Berlin, and they're working on documenting human rights violations with the conflict in Syria, and they use a lot of open source tools and very interesting methods, so they're going to share with us more information about the workflow that they're using for this, but especially focus on the geolocation techniques that they use. So if you're interested in this, you can sign up on our website. So the workshop is free to attend, but we only have a limited amount of places. So if you want to come, just check on the website and send us an email with your name, and then we can put you on the list. So yeah, hopefully see you there.
And so just we want to conclude the day and see you tomorrow. And thank you very much to the great speakers and the moderators we had today. Thank you.